Now I would like to introduce you all to our headliner, Hersh Shefrin. Together with Nobel laureate Richard Thaler, Hersh Shefrin developed an economic theory of self-control. He is the author of 7 books and numerous articles about how behavioral ideas impact real-world decisions. In 2009, his book Beyond Greed and Fear was recognized by J.P. Morgan Chase as one of the top 10 books published since 2000. He received his Bachelor's of Science degree from University of Manitoba, a master's in math degree from the University of Waterloo, and his PhD from the London School of Economics. He is frequently interviewed by the press, and his work was profiled by BBC TV. He writes a monthly blog post for Forbes and has intermittently written for the Wall Street Journal, the Huffington Post, and Vox. Well, clearly this is a terrific resume, and we have a great discussion upon us. So without further ado, I'll go ahead and pass it over to our speaker, Professor Shefrin, with the Perils of Denial.
So COP26, which you see here, stands for Conference of the Parties, number 26. And it's the 26th meeting of the United Nations, a group operating under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And the title for this talk actually was suggested by Kristen, who, after our discussions about controversies and concerns, thought this would be an appropriate way to think about the issue. So I put together an outline. I'm going to spend just a minute or two making clear what I plan to discuss this afternoon, and also to provide you with a sense of what the takeaway is. I think this is the most important slide in the presentation, so everything else is going to be commentary after this. So 5 points. First one is handwriting on the wall. It's a biblical term. What does it mean? And especially, what does it mean in the context of climate change? COP26. So COP26 is a conference. It will take place in Glasgow next month. And the key issues involve, what do we need to do? What do we need to get done in order to preserve human life on this planet for a very long time? 3, centerpiece of what we'll talk about today is pricing carbon at its social cost. How does that work? Why do we need to do it? Number 4 is COP21. This is the famous Paris Agreement. So I'll talk a little bit about Paris, but especially I want to talk about what got kicked down the road from Paris that we have to face now. And the final topic is this country. I'm going to be talking about the importance of pricing carbon and why it is that there is such resistance in this country to establishing a national carbon pricing policy. Some have called it fiscal denial. And the takeaway. So if there's anything you remember from this talk, I hope it will be this. Failure at COP26, failure in Glasgow next month to come up with a way of pricing carbon at its social cost globally will mean we virtually have no hope of preventing catastrophic temperature rises. And the risks are high that temperature rises will exceed our aspirational 1.5 degrees Celsius around 2030. They'll cross 2 degrees Celsius in 2050, and they'll cross 3 degrees Celsius in 2075. So I'm 73. I'm not sure I'll be around in 2075, but I think most of you will. I simply ask you to think about how old you're going to be at each of those stages, especially if this scenario plays itself out. Okay, so on to issue number 1, the handwriting on the wall. So the handwriting on the wall is an event described in the book of Daniel, in the Bible. And this is Rembrandt's depiction of that event. It involves the Babylonian king Belshazzar in his court, suddenly seeing handwriting appearing on the wall before him. And as you can see, everybody is quite startled in this painting. And the question is, what does the writing mean? Because none of them can tell. It's eventually deciphered by Daniel, the center figure in the book of Daniel who says there are basically three statements on the wall. The first one is, your days, Belshazzar, are numbered. The second is that your deeds have been weighed and you have been found wanting. That's a statement about judgment. And finally, your world will be broken up and divided. The actual words appearing on the wall are not everything that you see before you, but these three: numbered, weighed, and divided. Those are what the words mean, and everything else is Daniel's interpretation. The words appearing are actually in Aramaic. So here's what they looked like in Aramaic, and I'll pronounce them for you. Meneh, meneh, tekel, ufarsin. That's how they sound, and they correspond to number, weigh, and divide. And so the question we want to ask now is how these concepts play out in respect to climate change in the modern day world that we face. So if we were to tell the handwriting on the wall story today, who would Daniel be? I suggest Daniel would be James Hansen, whose picture you see before you, testifying before the United States Committee on Energy and Natural Resources. We heard about that committee in a previous presentation at this Turn conference. And James Hansen gave this talk in 1988. So we've had plenty of time to think about climate change. So what did he tell us? So when we think about his message, just think about these three words written on the wall. Meneh, meneh, number. So what's the number? So I'd like to suggest that the number refers to the atmospheric concentration of carbon. How much carbon there is in the atmosphere? Parts per million. And when Hansen spoke before the US Senate, he told us that parts per million of carbon were just below 350. And that was important because that was really quite high relative to historical concentration levels. And he thought it would be dangerous for them to rise really much more. Well, as it happens, if you look at the graph, you'll see that shortly after he gave his talk, concentration broke through the 350 barrier and have continued to rise, breaking through 400, and now at just around 417. Those are alarming numbers from a climate science perspective. Emissions have continued to grow. They dropped a little bit during the pandemic, but they seem to be back on track in terms of their trajectory. And given the danger, it's particularly, I don't know what to say, but disconcerting. The Union of Concerned Scientists, told us that more than half of all the industrial CO2 pollution that's been emitted since the beginning of the industrial age has happened after Hansen gave his talk. All right, so the second word of warning, tekel, weighing the consequences of our decisions. So I think that manifests itself in temperature change. And what you see here is a chart, a forecast that Hansen put together with some of his team at NASA. He ran the Goddard Institute. And in 1988, he put this forecast together for how he thought global temperatures would rise on our planet, depending on what we did from a policy perspective with respect to emissions. And his best guess, if we didn't adjust accordingly, would be the center curve, but you can see they're all ascending. Well, here's the actual plot, and I put into a box the portion that corresponds to the forecast, and you can see the forecast is pretty accurate. So just some things to keep in mind. It's been 3.2 million years since CO2 concentration has reached 400 parts per million, and now we're at 417. And if you look back at what things were like at that time, so temperatures were 3 to 4 degrees Celsius higher than today, and sea levels were 80 feet higher than today. Now, even the IPCC projections don't say that in the next 100, 200, or 300 years, we're going to get up to 80 feet, but there is concern we might get above 40, so 300 years from now. The thing about sea levels are we can make all kinds of changes, but sea levels are going to continue to rise almost no matter what we do now, given the degree to which we've increased carbon concentration. Okay, and the last word, Ufarsi, divide. So this really is sort of our world coming apart, at least in the Daniel's version. And if you look at what Hansen projected, so this is from a paper he wrote in 1981. And this is what he said in 1981. He said, if we get climate change because we don't do anything, what we're going to see are the drought-prone regions in North America and Central Asia really becoming hotter. We're going to see the West Antarctic arc sheet break up, and we're going to see a rise in sea level. And the images at the bottom, so that's Lake Mead, dropping to below 40% of capacity. We talked about that last night. Wildfires in California, we talked about that last night. Antarctic ice sheet breaking up, we talked about that last night, and sea level rising. So that's the first topic. Second topic is, what do we need to do at COP26? That's before us. What are the tasks? So there are 4. I'm going to talk about 2 today. The 2 I'll talk about are securing global net zero by mid-century to keep within our aspiration of 1.5 degrees temperature rise, and working together to deliver, which really means finalizing the Paris rulebook. Number 3 is mobilizing finance. So I teach finance, and this is a special interest to me. I won't have time to talk about that at all, but I do want to point out that this particular group is headed up by Mark Carney, a fellow Canadian. I'm Canadian, and I'll say a little bit about more about him at the end. So last month, during Climate Week, when the world's leaders gathered at the United Nations, Secretary General Antonio Guterres issued a warning, and he said he's really concerned that there's a high risk of failure at COP26. And he made this remark in a meeting with Boris Johnson. So Boris Johnson is I'm sure you know, the British Prime Minister, and Glasgow is part of the UK. So that was a concern, and I just ask you to remember what the takeaway from our discussion this afternoon is. Shortly after that warning, Boris Johnson spoke, and so you see the writing on the wall. Okay, and he said the world's got to grow up, face climate change, and he did it in a humorous way. He invoked Kermit the Frog to help him, but the message was pretty dire nonetheless. A few months before these meetings take place, usually high-level ministers who gather. This year they had to gather virtually, so they kind of talked about what the agenda is, and they had 5 major points on their agenda. Numbers 2 and 4, keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive and finalizing the Paris rule book by focusing on something called Article 6. Those were 2 out of the 5 things that were high on their list. And I have to say that they really did not achieve much by way of agreement on how to deal with these issues. And if they don't do it next month, then we really will have failure at COP26. So keeping 1.5 degrees Celsius alive. Of the various things that they talked about, there are 2 things that are really important. One is using carbon pricing to send clear market signals. And the other is phasing out fossil fuel subsidy. Okay? We need to reform that system. Those are the 2 things that they highlighted. They didn't say much else about it except what you see on this slide, at least in their published materials. But I just want to say that these really are hugely important, and I hope that we can make progress on these. In terms of issues to be finalized at COP26, these involve coming up with mechanisms for trading carbon permits to enable countries to purchase credits from another country in an effort to manage their emissions. And there are a lot of diverse views from, quote, the parties, meaning the members of the UN who are coming together. And there were also warnings about really being careful to construct systems that have validity and are well structured, because it's easy to get this wrong and to spin your wheels and wind up without emissions going down. And filings in the Paris Rulebook, Article 6. So Article 6 is what has gotten kicked down the road for years, but there are three pieces of it that are especially important. One is putting together a structure for trading emissions to get reduction, helping countries reduce emissions through offsets, and doing it right by not having double counting. If we don't get this right, just think about the takeaway from today's talk. There's a notion about how to think about some of this, and that's a notion of a carbon budget. And the IPCC has issued a warning, and they've said, here's a way to think about it. If we want to have any hope of staying within 1.5 degrees Celsius in terms of temperature rise, we cannot dump more than 300 gigatons of CO2 or its equivalents into the atmosphere. Okay. Last year, we dumped 31.5 gigatons of CO2 into the atmosphere. So if we continue at last year's pace, that budget's going to be gone in 8.5 years. And that's why in the logo of this conference, U-turn, we need to make a U-turn. Okay, so item number 3, a little history. This is Adam Smith. So Adam Smith's the father of modern economics. He wrote a book called The Wealth of Nations in 1776. He's was professor at the University of Glasgow. So we're coming full circle to Glasgow now with COP26. He wrote in Wealth of Nations that there's some goods, sugar, rum, and tobacco, that when consumers consume them, there are benefits, but on the whole, they sort of have negative side effects. And he suggested that goods like this, which were universally consumed, were proper subjects of taxation. Proper subjects of taxation. So the question is, does this apply to fossil fuels? So this is Bill McKibben, who founded 350.org. And he wrote in the late 1980s that once there was some understanding that it's coming into being, that we could see that there were serious threats from climate change in respect to global greenhouse gases, that most economists understood, because we've understood, at least from the time of Adam Smith, that one way of dealing with these issues is to use taxation. And so putting a price on carbon means really taxing carbon. Great resistance to this idea over the last decades. And you can see Grover Norquist, who is a strong advocate of reducing taxes, did this tweet a few years ago, and he said, look, here's what you want to understand about this carbon taxing idea. A tax on carbon is a tax on driving your car, on heating your home, on air conditioning, on flying in a plane, or taking a cruise on a ship, driving in an Uber, or running your fridge. And I say, that's right. You need to understand if we're going to deal with getting our emissions down, we have to do less of some or all of those things. And the way to do that is to make the things that are particularly problematic more expensive. It's the law of demand. That's what we teach in economics courses. That demand curves are downward sloping. If you increase the price, you reduce the quantity demanded. So this is Bill Nordhaus. Bill Nordhaus won the Nobel Prize, co-won the Nobel Prize in economics in 2018 for developing an integrated assessment model. I don't want you to read it. I just want you to know at the bottom of the screen that it's there, an 18 equation system, to analyze from an economics perspective how to price carbon. He wrote a very important book in the early 1990s called Managing the Global Commons. And here are some of his key messages. He said, first of all, understand we need a high price on CO2 emissions. That is the key to sharply reducing carbon emissions. If we do it, we're going to provide incentives that will help companies, but really everybody, move away from the old carbon-intensive technologies to low carbon technologies. And today, we don't have a sensible carbon pricing system in place. We have a muddled system that's not harmonized, and we need to harmonize. If we don't harmonize, we're not going to meet our climate targets. Repeat, if we don't harmonize, we're not going to meet our carbon targets. So if we want to meet those targets, we're going to have to do something sensible and soon about a global carbon pricing system. So just a couple of things. First of all, Nordhaus is very clear. He's not saying carbon taxation is all it's going to take to solve climate crisis. It's a twin set of policies. You have carbon pricing, and then you get a response to that leads you to low carbon technologies. And on the left, the graph that you see is what he saw as the price per ton of carbon. And you can see that it starts out below $50. In 2030, it hits $50, and then it rises rather dramatically after that until it crosses 300, and we've basically addressed climate change enough that we can start to let that price go down. We all have gasoline taxes now across the states. They vary. The lowest tax is about 9 cents in Alaska, and the highest is about 59 cents in Pennsylvania, and California and the state of Washington are close. And what happens when we impose gas taxes is that prices go up at the pump. So here's the thing. Remember, the lesson is we're not taxing because we're masochists. We're not taxing carbon because we're masochists. We're taxing because we want emissions to go down. And there are good studies, particularly with respect to automobiles, where you can see what happens as prices go up and down over time. I remember I was a young academic at Santa Clara in the 1970s. That's when OPEC quadrupled the price of oil. So prices shot up at the pump by a lot. I mean, they went up by a factor of 4. And at first, there were just gas lines and rationing and inconvenience. But several years later, we shifted from driving big cars to driving compacts. And that wasn't just a fluke. Over time, when prices go up at the pump, production of small cars goes up and production of standard cars goes down. We shift our mix. And that's the important lesson. We need prices to provide us with the incentives to move in the direction of addressing climate change sensibly. Now, there are lots of controversies among academics, whether they're economists or climate scientists. That shouldn't stop us from making progress. We want to confront each other with what we know and what we don't to sort out what's right and what's not. So two economists at the top of the screen, one is Lord Nicholas Stern, and the other is Joe Stiglitz. Joe Stiglitz is a Nobel Prize winner. Nicholas Stern is the foremost British economist when it comes to climate change and wrote what's known as the Stern Report on climate change. And they take issue not with so much with the model structure, but with the input parameters, and therefore the outputs in Nordhaus's model. And they tell us Nordhaus's carbon taxes are too low to get the job done. $50 a ton by 2030 is too low. We need to be thinking closer to 100. Okay. A lot of people are talking about 75 now and splitting the difference, but they're closer to 100. And they don't think we're going to get to 1.5, otherwise. And I can tell you, I'm just showing you now on the left and the right are Nordhaus's graphs, and you do not get to net zero emissions by 2050 with the Nordhaus parameters. You get to peak emissions at 2050, not net zero. And the temperature rises. They eventually get to above 3 degrees Celsius in the Nordhaus framework. So if you want to avoid 3, you're going to simply have to be stronger if you believe what the models say. This is Marty Weitzman. Marty Weitzman was, unfortunately, passed away a couple of years ago, but Nordhaus said he was the preeminent environmental economist in the world. And he had a lot to say about the Stern Report and about the Nordhaus model. And the most important thing he had to tell us was how much we don't know and how we should be reacting to how much we don't know. He said we need to focus on what we don't know, what we can't quantify, and how that might change the final outcome. And his basic lesson to us was that means you need to have high carbon prices because the possibility of catastrophic disaster from climate change is too high. We don't know what's going to happen, but we need to act as if we're taking out an insurance policy. And I've gotten a book by Stephen Koonin that came out in April called Unsettled, where Koonin, who is an academic and very bright at NYU, argues that climate science is unsettled, that climate scientists don't agree with each other, and suggests that really we ought to be careful about taking such strong action. But you see, Marty Weitzman would have told us, well, if there is stuff that's unsettled, maybe not as much as Koonin suggests, but if it's unsettled with what we know, what we do know, we don't know, we need to be bold when it comes to carbon pricing. And that means high rather than low. So the IMF has been looking and thinking very seriously about climate change. And they tell us a few things that are quite interesting. The first is that carbon pricing is actually gaining momentum, that there are lots and lots of carbon tax and emissions trading programs around the world. It's just that it's small. It's only about 20%. And the average global price is only $3 a ton. We need it to be higher. We need to be up at 50 by 2030. We should be up in the 20s, maybe 30, 35 today. So it's a far cry. You can see on your left that there are a whole variety of countries, starting with Sweden, going down Switzerland, Finland, Norway, and so on. They all have different carbon prices. So we don't have harmonized systems. We don't have a global system where you can trade emission permits. So carbon pricing needs to be there. It's not the only thing, but it's a key part of a comprehensive mitigation strategy. And we need to get between 1/4 and 1/2 of emissions down if we're going to make 1.5. There are lessons from Sweden, which has the highest carbon tax, $137 a ton. So they've had it for years. And not 137 a ton. They started off lower and got to 137. But what we can see from their experiences, real GDP has not fallen in Sweden with those high rates. Okay, real GDP has gone up. And GHG, greenhouse gas emissions, have gone down by 27% between 1990 and 2018. So the point is, carbon taxes could work, and they could work without killing the economy. Okay, so now we're on to item 4. So Paris. So I will tell you, I mean, I know that there was a lot of excitement, and some good things did come out of the Paris Agreement, which is COP21, the 21st meeting. But we didn't do the job we needed to do. We know from the work of real scientists that the key variable driving average temperatures on our planet has been CO2 parts per million. And since the 80s, economists have been calling for carbon taxes. And in 1988, we were at 350 or thereabouts. And you know, if we would have gone to carbon taxes at that time, it could have been low and we would have stabilized. But it didn't happen. And that takes us to Paris, where it didn't happen either. So I wrote a blog post for Forbes right after that conference, the Paris conference. And I said, you know, it's great, but it's just like a New Year's resolution. We know what happens with New Year's resolutions. They do not wind up getting kept. Issues of self-control, addiction, our need for dopamine, our difficulty in delaying gratification, all those psychological issues played out at Paris. And the key leader at Paris was a woman, Christiana Figueres, also did her PhD at the LSE like me. And she said explicitly, I would rather move now on what we can do than wait for economists' perfection. That was the way she addressed the question of why aren't we going to come up with a carbon pricing agreement as part of the overall Paris Agreement. So back to James Hansen. Just before the COP meeting in Copenhagen, he came out and said, we need carbon taxes and we will not be able to solve our climate change challenge without doing it. And he said it again just before Paris. And when it didn't happen, right after the conference, he wrote a piece and he said, Paris was a fraud because we didn't do carbon taxes and we needed to do them. So John Kerry led the US delegation to the Paris meeting. And he was asked about Hansen's fraud statement, and he said he rejected it. With all due respect, I understand the criticisms because it doesn't have a mandatory scheme, doesn't have a compliance enforcement mechanism. But we have 186 countries, he said, all of which submitted independent plans with national contributions for reducing emissions. And we have transparency so we can know what everybody's doing. So that's what Kerry said right after Paris. What did he say subsequently? Well, 3 years afterwards, he was complaining in a New York Times op-ed that the worldwide emissions were forecasted to continue to rise 2.7%. And they've been growing at 2.5% a year, okay, even with decarbonization. So now in 2021, he's telling us that COP26 is really the last chance we have for the world to avoid climate disaster. Let me say it again. COP26 is the last chance for the world to avoid climate disaster. And he also told us just last month that he's now the chief climate change leader, heads our climate change initiative for the US, that President Biden is considering a carbon tax and a carbon border tariff adjustment for countries that don't live up to their promises. Considering, but that's as far as it goes. So Nordhaus tells us on where we are now. Look, the carbon price landscape, okay, is varied, and we don't have harmony. We have carbon prices are low across the globe, and they need to be high. And worse, we are subsidizing fossil fuels. So on net, the price of fossil fuels is actually negative. So it's even worse than we can imagine. And the Paris Agreement is simply not ambitious enough to reach target decarbonization at 2 degrees Celsius, let alone 1. So his diagnosis, writing on the wall, international climate policy is, this is several months ago, at a dead end. And we simply have to have other mechanisms. Economists call them climate compacts or climate clubs. Okay, number 5, what's happening in our country? So the large photo at your left is Ted Halstead, the late Ted Halstead, I'm sorry to say, who founded the Climate Leadership Council. And this is a council that, really an initiative that pulled together Republicans and Democrats in an effort to come up with a compromise solution to a carbon pricing structure for us, for the US. And it involved James Baker, Janet Yellen, Hank Paulson, Larry Summers, very notable people. And they didn't agree on everything, but each of them sort of got a little piece, and they came up with something they thought would work, a compromise deal. So you'd have a carbon fee, they call it a fee, not a tax, that will go up gradually. You'll take the revenue and pay it back as a dividend to Americans. You'll go light on regulations for energy firms, and you'll put in place border quota adjustments so that it's difficult for countries that have high emissions but produce stuff cheaply to sell them in the US. So we won't sort of circle around and avoid the impact of having carbon taxes impact our industry. So that was a Climate Leadership Council proposal. And honestly, all 4 elements make a lot of sense to me. Janet Yellen took her participation on the CLC and got put together a petition for all the economists in the world, anyone who wanted to, who was interested in signing. So there were a lot of US economists who signed on saying we need to have carbon pricing. And subsequently, I just want to give you a sense of what happens politically. So the economists are pretty much, all on board with carbon pricing as being really important and something we should do. But that's not true in the political sphere. So on the Republican side, whether you're talking about the House voting to disavow carbon tax, which they did during the previous administration, or John Barrasso writing letters to the editor talking about flaws in carbon pricing plans. That's on the Republican side. The Democrats, who you think would be in favor of carbon taxes, they've been turning away from a carbon tax. And that's largely because of a concern about low-income groups being impacted disproportionately by carbon taxes, although I think the dividend portion can alleviate that. And this issue came up last night, so I added it into this slide. So you want to understand that yes, low-income Americans, there are issues to face, but this is a global problem. And the US and Saudi America have the highest per capita emissions in the world. And Canada comes next. So relative to what's happening in the developed world, we just want to try and keep in context this particular issue. And we need to be leading. We need to be out in front on carbon taxes, not lagging behind, in order to establish some kind of a global agreement. So, in earlier part of this year, when President Biden put out his climate plan, carbon taxes weren't part of it. And then, John Kerry was speaking to NPR in the summer, and he said, well, we're thinking about border adjustments and we're thinking about a price on carbon. but it hasn't gotten beyond that. So I'd say this just isn't bold enough, and there isn't enough leadership on this issue coming out of the White House, and that is problematic. Ted Deutsch, Congressman Ted Deutsch, introduced a bill, HR 2307, that does have carbon pricing and dividend tax. And this came, really the initiative for this was from the Citizens Climate Lobby, who rallied grassroots support to make this happen, and convinced Representative Deutsch to do it. And so this plan involves starting in the US at $15 a ton, and then going up by $10 a year, thereafter, and putting the money into a carbon dividend trust fund. That's the idea. So our speaker last night represented Citizens Climate Lobby, and they deserve a lot of credit for getting this initiative to be introduced. But we need to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. And the House Democrats are making no move on this, just the opposite. And I think that's particularly problematic. Okay, so it needs to be part of the budget reconciliation package. Joe Manchin, okay, and Kirsten Sinema, they are, as we heard last night, key decision makers in all of this. And Manchin is really not for it, and Kirsten is open, so it remains to be seen. Ron Wyden from Oregon, senator from Oregon, and the Senate Finance Committee, is trying to get something in, although they're going to leave out gasoline, which is a big source of the problem. So, I mean, half a loaf is better than none. I don't know whether we'll get it, but it would be, it would be better with gasoline not excluded. It's very important to understand how this country is divided on climate change generally and on support for a carbon tax in particular. So the Yale communication studies really tell us important stuff. So first of all, most Democrats are in favor of it. Most Republicans are not. Overall, 63% of registered voters support a carbon tax. So that's not even close to 50%. But because we're divided in the way that we are, and because the political system is skewed, and there's a very important work done by David Shore, written up in the New York Times, to tell us that it's, our political system is unbalanced. Democrats, Republicans, even if the Democrats who are more in favor of carbon taxes get 51% of the vote, they're not going to get 51% of the power. So just keep in mind, American households on average have said they're willing to pay just about 14 to 15% more for energy if we get a carbon tax. But whether that translates into political action remains to be seen. So we're one of the only countries that don't have a national carbon fee. And Nordhaus tells us, we're just sitting here on an island of fiscal denial because carbon taxes work. They will get us to where we need to go, when we need to go. It's not that it won't be painful, there will be pain, but the pain will be bearable. Okay? We just need to wake up. Who are the largest emitters in the world? Not per capita, but in total. So China's number one, and they're working very hard. I think the Chinese, really important to understand just how hard they are working to address climate change. And some of it is because they want to be the leaders in emissions technology. And then we're number two, okay, number two. Everybody else, except with the exception of Australia and Russia, has a national carbon policy of some sort. So I just want to say, this is Janet Yellen again and Mark Carney. Mark Carney is heading up. Mark Carney was the governor of the Bank of England, and before that, the governor of the Bank of Canada. He and Janet Yellen together are working to outline what it's going to take to get to net zero by 2050. And one of the most important things they tell us is it squawks in at the top. Meaningful carbon prices are a cornerstone of any effective policy package. We just need to do it. We need to get behind it. And just, parenthetically, I just want to say something else about Mark Carney. So yesterday, when we were talking about issues that face Indigenous peoples, we had great speakers, some from Alberta in Canada, and the area around the Athabasca tar sands that we focused on. So Mark Carney grew up he was born in Fort Smith in the Northwest Territories, just north of Alberta. And he moved to Edmonton, just like one of our speakers. He grew up in Edmonton. And he is very sensitive to all of these issues. Okay, I hope I'm wrong. I don't think there's enough leadership out of the White House on carbon taxes. And I think that the mistake could be monumental because carbon price is that important. If COP26 is successful, what we will see in the 2030s and 2040s and 2050s is enormous market activity that allows efficiency to take place with respect to the way we emit greenhouse gas emissions. And that will be to the benefit of everyone. But if we don't have the political will to get us there, it just isn't going to happen. And that's why the handwriting's on the wall. Handwriting's on the wall because emissions continue to grow. You have the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, major investors around the world. They're all calling for a global price on carbon. And politically, it's not happening. And so, if we fail, this is again the takeaway for today. If we fail at COP26 to put a global pricing carbon mechanisms in place that prices carbon at its social cost, we simply don't have a hope of preventing catastrophic temperature rises. And we will see them go up. And you, in your lifetime, will see them go up to 1.5, 2, and 3, and maybe higher. Just think about how old you're going to be in 2030, 2050, and 2075. Okay, so with that, I'll stop and turn it back to Malachi.
Wow, that was a great presentation, Professor Shefrin. Thank you so much for all of that information. And I definitely want to open the floor to the audience if they have any questions that they would like to ask you that popped up during the presentation. So if you have a question you would like to speak, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the chat and we'll go ahead and call on you. I believe somebody wrote something earlier in the chat, Jerry Tolley, and it states, I'm guessing that your projections are based on a linear model. Isn't there a chance of a pivotal event that pushes the temperature dramatically higher and dramatically faster?
So the short answer is, the models are, they're not linear models, they are nonlinear models. But this is, so the answer to the question, there's two parts. One is, are they linear or nonlinear? So they have linear elements and nonlinear elements. But the big answer is, yes, it's possible. And that's why Marty Weitzman's cautionary remarks are so important, that they could be higher. And you know, the numbers that I've thrown out, the differences that come between economists as to what the right price of carbon is have to do with really disagreements about what the parameters are or the functional forms. But they all use the same sort of models, but there's this thing called model risk. We could have the models wrong. And we do have to be concerned that things might be even worse than we thought. Nordhaus, in his reports to the National Academy of Science, which he's done over several years, you can see he keeps on telling them, I keep on having to revise my estimates for both temperature and emissions from the last version because I've been optimistic things keep turning out worse than I thought. And so that's an indication that the bias has been in one direction. And therefore, yes, great question. And I think reason for cause for concern.
Absolutely. Well, I have a question that I would like to ask you. So one of the things that you mentioned throughout the presentation was the opportunity for carbon pricing, and we were raising the prices to essentially reduce the amount of carbon emissions that are going into the atmosphere. So one of the worries that I have with that, or things that I think we should mention, is the inequalities in different ways in which countries may have more GDP or higher GDP, like more money that they can use to purchase these carbon certificates, or have a higher placement within the carbon market, further developing inequalities between different countries and who is actually producing the most carbon emissions. So what is your take on that, essentially?
Yes, that is a great question, Malachi. We have to be concerned about inequality. We have to be concerned, actually, that the impacts, as uncomfortable though they'll be on the developed world, will be even worse for people living in developing countries. And so the finance portion of COP26 is focusing on setting up transfers from the developing world, from the developed world to the developing world, $100 billion a year, to try and address those inequalities. And there is something in it. So part of it is, you can think of it as aid, but part of it is because if we don't help the developing world transition effectively, they're going to continue to rely on dirty sources of generating energy, and that's simply going to make the problem worse for everybody. So it's in our interest as in the developing world to help them make that transition, and that will serve both to, I won't say level the playing field, because I don't think it will do that, but it will certainly help move us in that direction. And it will also alleviate the degree of emissions from brown sources, shall we say. So I do have a lot of conviction that if we price carbon at social cost, it may not get us to perfection, but we don't want to let perfection be the enemy of the good. We can really make a huge dent in the climate change problem if we go with a mixed solution, private sector, public sector, and carbon taxes. I mean, you can use cap and trade, which is a market-based solution. I think we should just tax it, and we'll call it a carbon fee. People sort of don't like the word tax. It psychologically conjures up negatives for them, but it is a tax. And just simply make certain that we're intelligent about the way we use the tax revenue, and use all the tools that are disposable to address the problem. Otherwise, we're just going to wind up kicking ourselves in the foot. And I have to tell you, I'm very disappointed in the progressive wing of the Democratic Party for their stance on carbon pricing, because the people they want to help, well, maybe they'll help them in the next year or two. But if we're talking about the poor of 2035, they're going to be much worse off because we don't have carbon pricing. So the poor of the future are going to be poorer, I think, because of a reluctance to deal with this issue.
I want to thank Malachi and Hersh for this incredible session. You have captured the urgency and the logic and the astonishment and the mettle that we need to solve this crisis. And I would love for Santa Clara University to be a leader in writing those letters and making those phone calls to John Kerry, President Biden, and everyone that's voting on anything to do with a climate tax, because it's clearly a part of a multi-pronged solution effort, that includes planting trees just as much as anything else. So thank you very much. And if anyone else has questions, I'm sure our speakers would be happy to stay for a moment, but it was just wonderful. And I appreciate the great audience coming together on this Tuesday afternoon for this. And I invite you to the 4 o'clock talk on the earth on your plate and to the 6 o'clock arts and climate crisis session as well. So thank you, everyone.